the topic here, what is a healthy carbohydrate, is a question, obviously, and I put it out there as a question because that's really the intent of the meeting, is to try to answer this question as best we can. I'm not going to pretend to answer it, but perhaps put out some thoughts and ideas and some of the challenges that I've found for the last 25 years in trying to say what is a healthy carbohydrate. I just haven't been able to come up with a simple answer. Of course, carbohydrates for some time were the poster children of the nutrition community. This, I think, represents the generally accepted wisdom of the early 1990s that carbohydrates were good. It didn't matter too much what they were. In fact, there was a general belief, in fact, official policy of the American Diabetic Association, that all carbohydrates are the same and they're good for us. That was the base of the pyramid, up to 11 servings a day, and that didn't count the potatoes there that were included as vegetables, and all fats were bad. Up at the top, avoid fats and oils as much as possible, basically. That, for quite a while, was mainstream nutrition. But what's emerged is, I think, quite analogous to fat, that total fat is almost meaningless too. The type of fat is extraordinarily important. And we have really bad fats, trans fats, not such good fats, saturated fats, and then on the other end of the spectrum, essential fatty acids that are necessary for viability. And then many other fats have good metabolic effects, even if they're not essential. So there, again, is, I think, a lot of analogy when we look at the carbohydrate picture. But there's not a simple way to classify carbohydrates, or at least we have for fat. You can run it through a gas chromatography column and identify the specific fatty acids and make ratios and things like that out of what we get. It's not so obvious, not so clear for carbohydrate. As Livia mentioned, there's been even more confusion in the past few weeks with the publication of the Salim Yousef's group in The Lancet, looking at carbohydrate and total mortality in the PURE study, which was, I think, has been and is an ongoing attempt to fill in some sort of black holes in the picture of diet around the world, collecting data from a lot of countries where there's very little information, particularly low and middle income countries, and essentially build that into a prospective cohort study. But there are many complications and challenges in doing this kind of study. In some ways, we want to look at this population because things are changing really rapidly. But on the other hand, if essentially diet is changing rapidly and you pick one point in time, as they did in their study, what you measure at that point, even if you measure it perfectly, is not going to be representative of what people have been eating over the last 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 years, and it's not going to be representative of what they're eating in the next few years either. So you really need repeated measurements in that kind of situation where diets are changing very rapidly if you're going to make sense about how diet relates to long-term disease, especially things like cardiovascular disease and cancer, where much of the effects of diet are cumulative, or the initiation of cancers was decades before the cancer appears. But they did come to this conclusion that high carbohydrate intake was associated with an increased risk of total mortality, a relative risk of 1.28, highly significant for the top quintile compared to the bottom quintile. And this was not with risk of cardiovascular disease or cardiovascular mortality. Interestingly, the high carbohydrate intake was mostly related to other conditions, whereas we might have expected it to show up most for cardiovascular disease. They unfortunately acknowledged that they didn't really have any good measures of diet quality, carbohydrate quality in particular there. So again, it's really a very, very crude look at data. And another aspect of it, of the study that was unusual, was because of the populations they chose, carbohydrate intake was really high. As you can see on the right, are either of these, many of the populations had intakes of 70 and 80, even more than 80% of calories from carbohydrate. which usually typifies really poor populations and poverty diets, basically, that are likely to be deficient in many, many ways. In fact, about a third of the population of pure came from China, and my Frank Hu and my other Chinese colleagues don't understand anything, how this came to be, because they don't know any of the investigators, they don't know where the populations were, and the average fat intake was 17% of calories, which was lower than Bangladesh, and the national intake is now about 28% of calories at the time these studies were done. So somehow this is in some little isolated corner of China that almost for sure was very poor and not at all representative of China. That's not to say it's not correct, but it's not. This is, even for the countries that were studied, it looks like not very typical. Well, back to the topic for this next 2 days, the definitions of carbohydrate quality. And the complexity here is, I think there are many potential definitions, and I really view this as a multidimensional issue of how to define carbohydrate quality. There's multiple dimensions, and no one dimension captures everything that we'd like to know about carbohydrate quality. I think everybody here is familiar with this list, but just to put it on the table, glycemic index, obviously pioneered by Dr. Jenkins and his colleagues. Very important concept. I don't have to explain it. Glycemic load, which takes into account the quantity of carbohydrate as well as the glycemic index and their interaction, which is represented by essentially by multiplication, but it is a biological interaction, I think. If you have more carbohydrate, then the glycemic index is even more important. That just makes sense. And dietary fiber, and of course we can there's another whole world of different ways to define fiber in the diet. Fructose, there's some people who believe that's the whole problem, and sugar is the whole problem, and obviously I think none of us here believes that eating large amounts of sugar is good for us, but it's not the whole problem. It's a piece of the picture. And then another way of defining carbohydrate is by whole grain versus refined grain, and that's, I find, clearly extremely valuable, but it doesn't account for the glycemic index in a full manner. There's within that intact whole grains and milled whole grains. So each one of these has complexity about it. And we can also define carbohydrate by the source of the carbohydrate, as in carbohydrates from grains, carbohydrates from fruits and vegetables, carbohydrates from dairy, carbohydrates from potatoes. And actually I find that pretty useful because it does sort of encapsulate the way we actually eat the carbohydrates. So from a consumer standpoint, that's really helpful, and it does account for all the other things that come along with a carbohydrate. Most foods that we eat outside of pure sugar are not pure carbohydrate. The carbohydrate travels along with other components as well. And then, very importantly, are sugar-sweetened beverages, which essentially sugar dissolved in water, and that seems to make a very big difference. It makes everything worse because, in part, the sweetness is seductive, and secondly, you can consume such vast amounts of sugar when we consume it in this way. And probably just by the huge bolus that we get can have particularly adverse metabolic effects. So this is a paper we published a long time ago. I think it was the first paper that actually used glycemic load as a variable, and we found that very useful. But this sort of represents how I look at carbohydrate quality to a large extent, which is two-dimensional, looking here at risk of type 2 diabetes, where we see that cereal fiber is inversely related to risk, and glycemic load is positively related to risk. And the worst risk for type 2 diabetes is among those with high glycemic load and low cereal fiber intake. And so these two dimensions are hard to combine in a single variable. That's part of our challenge that we face. And then, just as an example, looking at sugar-sweetened beverages in type 2 diabetes, This is from the Nurses' Health Study 2 quite a while ago, and we found almost doubling of risk with 1 or more servings of sugar-sweetened beverage per day. And when we adjust for BMI, which is increased with sugar-sweetened beverages, then in that multivariate analysis, there's still about a 40% increase in risk for 1 or more sugar-sweetened beverages per day. And of course, we statistically removed the effect of obesity, but in the real world, you don't just make a model and make obesity go away. That's part of the reality of drinking a lot of sugar-sweetened beverages. So how do we incorporate sugar-sweetened beverages in our definition of carbohydrate quality? Again, it seems like a third dimension. This figure actually took about $5,000 to make because I had not really found any other data set that had variables like this, which are carbohydrates from specific sources. And so we had to have our dietitians, I had to get them to work overtime because it wasn't something funded by our grants, to actually go through the NHANES data and recode the variables as carbohydrate from added sugar, carbohydrate from refined grain, carbohydrate from potatoes, carbohydrate from whole grain, and other carbohydrates, and where total energy intake is the full pie here. And again, I do find this a very useful, practical way to look at carbohydrates. It doesn't cover everything, but it's interesting in several ways that, as you can see, almost exactly 50% of calories in the US diet come from carbohydrate. And that means it's sort of amazing how a big piece of the diet carbohydrate is, and yet we've paid much less attention to it than fat in the diet. Everyone in this room, of course, excluded, but if you look in the general literature until very recently, the whole attention was much more on type of fat or fat in the diet. And it's also interesting to note that this is from about 2012, just several years ago, that the huge majority, about 80% of that 50%, is added sugar, refined grain, and potatoes, which says a lot about the quality of the carbohydrate in the US diet. And whole grains is still a pretty thin slice of the carbohydrate in the US diet. We've started to use this in some analyses in our large cohort studies. One thing that is also increasingly recognized, I don't know why we didn't recognize it 20 years ago, but when we look at something in the diet, we really have to, first of all, do it in an isocaloric or close to isocaloric context, which in a controlled feeding experiment, yes, you would make it isocaloric right away in general. If you want to say something specific about a component, you'd want to make sure that the diets were isocaloric, unless you're looking at weight. That's one of the few exceptions. So we have been adjusting for total energy intake in most of our analyses, and that's become pretty standard in the field. But the substitution issue is really critically important. And again, if you were designing an experiment, you add fat, you immediately have to ask, what's the control diet? What's replacing fat in the diet? And what's replacing fat will make a huge difference in your outcome. But in most epidemiologic analyses until just a couple of years ago, that replacement was not specified. So if you control calories and you don't specify the replacement, you're by default comparing whatever you're looking at, whether it be whole grains or red meat, with all the other calories in the diet. And I just showed you what the other calories in the diet were coming from, at least on the carbohydrate side. So it's mostly unhealthy carbohydrates is what the comparison if you don't specify something. And on the other side of the equation, a lot of that is red meat, until recently a lot of partially hydrogenated oils, which the vast majority of the calories are really coming from bad stuff. And so if you're looking at red meat and don't specify the comparison, you may not see much with red meat because you're comparing it with a lot of other bad stuff in the diet, a lot of refined starch, sugar, partially hydrogenated oils. So this is an example of a more recent paper looking at replacement of dairy fat with different energy sources and making very explicit comparisons, essentially on an isocaloric basis, comparing different sources of energy versus dairy fat. So on the first line, for example, you can see substituting vegetable fat in place of dairy fat for 5% of energy, about a 10% lower risk. Other animal fats in the opposite direction, but I really wanted to pay attention to the bottom two bars there. If we replace dairy fat with whole grains, there's a substantially lower risk of cardiovascular disease. But if we replace it with refined starches, it's about an even swap in terms of risk of cardiovascular disease. But again, if you just lump them all together and talk about carbohydrate, most of it's coming from refined carbohydrate, and you'd get probably a slight benefit. It looks like replacing calories from butter with the typical mix of carbohydrate in the US diet. But that, again, lumping all carbohydrates together would really give a very misleading picture. More recently, one of our doctoral students is taking another look at carbohydrate quality here in relation to risk of type 2 diabetes. This is not yet published, but if you look at in this analysis, just total carbohydrate, it's about, on the left there, it's essentially not related to risk of type 2 diabetes. But if we look at starch, again, a variable not very many people have used, there's a substantial increase in risk. If you look at total fiber, substantially lower risk. Cereal fiber, even lower risk. Fruit fiber, lower risk. Vegetable fiber, maybe pretty neutral, maybe a slight increase in risk. So if you're looking at carbohydrate through these different lenses, you get very, very different pictures here, with cereal fiber representing whole grains in general. And here it's important to remember that this isn't just cereal fiber, it's coming with a whole package of other nutrients and phytochemicals sort of under the banner of cereal fiber. Then look, you can make some ratios out of this. As you would guess, looking at the last data point there, essentially the ratio of starch to cereal fiber gives the strongest relative risk in relation to risk of type 2 diabetes. So exactly how to most usefully represent fiber here, we're still thinking about this. There's so many ways you can look at carbohydrate quality, and it's not totally obvious what's going to be the best, most helpful. This is really just looking at these same variables, but on a quintile basis. And as you can see, the lower at the top there, that's different sources. This is sources of fiber, vegetable fiber being the one that's not really related to lower risk, and cereal fiber, the red at the bottom. So fiber per se seems to have different relationship with disease risk. We've seen this for cardiovascular disease before, and somehow cereal fiber comes out to be the big winner here among the different fiber sources. Probably not from the fiber per se, but again, the things that travel along with it. And looking at ratios on this more or less continuous way, at the top, basically, that gray line is carbohydrate to cereal fiber ratio. One of the things we're trying to do here is see what might be useful information you could pick up from nutrition facts, and looking at different ratios of using data that's already there on the package. We don't have cereal fiber. We do, but that would look to be most strongly related to risk of type 2 diabetes if you're trying to just use readily available information. We're looking at here one of the other bits of information looking at stroke. We really don't see much relationship with total carbohydrate, with starch, with cereal fiber, or with total fiber when we look at different subtypes of stroke. And looking at total stroke is an issue. Again, we don't see much with glycemic index or glycemic load either. One important issue when we look at all of these aspects of diet is the shape of the dose-response relationship. Is it linear? And even if whole grains are good for us, is the relationship with health outcomes really linear, just more the better? That can't really be true. At some point, you can get too many whole grains. They displace other components of diet. There's anti-nutrient effects by binding or some essential nutrients can be a problem at really high intakes. This is from a meta-analysis done recently. Some hints that there may be, for some health outcomes, some nonlinear relationships, but at the higher end, we don't have as much data as we'd like to. I think at this point in time, I find it hard to say from the literature what is really is there an optimal whole grain consumption that above which benefit flattens out or even starts to go the other way. So that's just one of the questions I think we have to ask when we look at definitions and guidelines for carbohydrate intake and even whole grains. Another important point is interaction. And probably the most important underlying interaction is with insulin resistance. And Jenny has written about that and many others, and we find that very consistently. This is going back to stroke again. If we stratify by BMI, then we do find that total carbohydrate intake is positively related to risk of stroke among people with a BMI of over 25, but below BMI of 25, we don't see any increase in risk. And for many different endpoints, we do see this underlying interaction with insulin resistance. And Arnie is looking at this in another way more recently, but that seems to be very important, that if we have a really lean, physically active population, they're going to be able to tolerate glycemic load better than an insulin-resistant, sedentary, a little bit overweight population. And finally, I think it's an interesting question to ask how we've been doing. Have we made an impact in terms of carbohydrate quality? And it looks like collectively we are. It's a bit hard to say what exactly, what message, what action has contributed. But right at the very bottom is a line for whole grains. This is an analysis we've done looking at trends in diet quality in the United States using NHANES survey data. It's really the one body of nationally representative data of diet we have in the United States. And I realized a few years ago that nobody was actually tracking diet quality in the United States, which seems like a fundamental variable to be watching over time. So what we did was to apply our alternative healthy eating index, which we know predicts heart disease, mortality, many other outcomes very well, and apply that index to the NHANES data to look at trends in diet quality. On average, we're going up. We've gone from about 40 in year 2000 to about 50 now, but that's on a scale of 100. So there's a huge gap between where we could be. And that's sort of the story for whole grains. That red line on the bottom, you can see it actually has gone up on a percentage-wise basis. Maybe it's a little bit hard to tell. That's from this. This is not grams. This is our scale. But there has been a real increase in whole grains, but it's way below what it should be. This is up to a score of 2 on a scale of 10. That whole grains has a long, long way to go before we are taking what we should be. The other the biggest change has been trans fat. Again, this is a higher score means less trans fat, so we've almost eliminated trans fat. But the other factor that's changed most has been sugar-sweetened beverages, that blue line right in the middle, where we have reduced sugar-sweetened beverage consumption by about 25% in the United States, which that's really important. That took behavioral change and is having health benefits already, we can see. So that's a quick overview. I find this a little challenging, and I hope I will be greatly enlightened during the next 2 days. Thank you.